If you watch movies, you notice that usually within the first few minutes, you are introduced to the main characters and to the plot. This plot is then developed throughout the rest of the movie. For example, in romantic movies, within the first few minutes, you may be introduced to a really beautiful girl and a handsome-looking guy, but they live far and far away from each other. Because it's a romantic movie, you know that they will end up together and fall in love. But you have to watch the movie to find out how this will actually happen. The same is true for action movies. In an action movie, within the first few minutes, we know who the bad guys are and who the good guys are. Either the bad guys have committed a crime and the good guys are trying to catch them, or perhaps the bad guys are planning to do something really, really bad and the good guys are trying to prevent them from doing this. This is also true of novels. Often in the first chapter of a novel, we are introduced to the main characters and to the plot. When we read the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, we are introduced to the main characters and the plot. The main characters are God, people, and Satan. The plot is that people disobeyed God, and this created a distance between them and God. This plot is then developed throughout the rest of the Bible. Genesis is the first book of the Bible, but it's also part of a subsection in the Old Testament called the Pentateuch. The word Pentateuch comes from two different words which mean 5 and scroll. These 5 books are also called the books of Moses, the law, and the Jewish people refer to them as the Torah. Torah really means law, but it also means teaching or instruction. When we refer to the law, it doesn't mean that every single thing in that book is related to the law or is actually law. As a matter of fact, the book of Genesis is mainly a historical book. We find very little law in it. But we have to picture the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, as one volume that was written on 5 different scrolls. And each different scroll has a distinct emphasis. Jesus referred to these books in Luke chapter 16, verse 16, when he mentioned the law and the prophets. The Pentateuch covers the time from the creation of the world up until the time when the Israelites were ready to enter the Promised Land. So let's look at the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis can really be divided into 2 separate sections: Genesis 1 through 11 and Genesis 12 through 50. Like any story, the story we find in the Bible has to have a beginning. And what better beginning than the very beginning, which is the existence of God and the creation of the world. Genesis actually does not explain the beginning or the existence of God. Genesis simply begins with the statement, "In the beginning, God." The complete statement is actually, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." This is a Hebrew expression that simply means that God created everything that exists. Genesis reveals that God created the heavens and the earth out of nothing by his spoken word. Throughout the creation story, we are introduced to the main characters and the setting of the Bible. The main characters are God, Adam and Eve and their offspring, and Satan. The setting is the created world. After creating the universe and earth and everything on the earth, God created Adam and Eve. They were created in the image of God. This not only states that Adam and Eve had a likeness to God, but also that they were created for the purpose of having a relationship with God. We see this relationship between Adam and Eve and God as they lived in the Garden of Eden, and God came down to talk to them. As Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden, God gave them only one rule. They were not allowed to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve started out well, but soon things started to go wrong. The perfect picture of Genesis 1 and 2 changed in chapter 3. The enemy of God, Satan, appeared in the form of a serpent. He tempted Adam and Eve to disobey God. And unfortunately, Adam and Eve did not resist that temptation. They decided to go ahead and eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They disobeyed God. This is what we call sin. Sin is really nothing more than disobedience to God. As a result, the relationship Adam and Eve had with God was damaged and they were sent out of the garden. In the middle of this very negative situation, God told Satan, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." That's in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Here is a message of hope that at some time in the future, somebody will defeat Satan. Then the text takes us back to the result of sin. Chapter 4 shows us how quickly the situation in Adam and Eve's family became really, really bad. Adam and Eve disobeyed God by eating from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. After they were sent out of the garden, they had 2 sons, and one son murdered the other. This shows how quickly things went from bad to worse. Chapter 5 gives us the genealogy from Adam to Noah. This is basically like fast forwarding. It's kind of like watching a movie or a TV program where all of a sudden there is a series of pictures or a segment that they fast forward, it goes a lot faster, and then it slows down again. A person's ancestry in Hebrew culture was really, really important. Moses could just have written, "A long time after that, Noah was born." But the question in the minds of the Hebrews would have been, who is Noah and where did he come from? How does he fit into the story? Who were his ancestors? And that is why his line of ancestry is included. In Genesis chapter 6 through 9, we read that by the time of Noah, there was so much sin on the earth that God decided to destroy the earth with a flood. But in his grace, God also decided to save Noah and his family. Sadly enough, this did not solve the sin problem. After the flood, Noah became drunk and he exposed himself because he fell asleep naked in his tent. Genesis 10 and 11 tells us the story of the descendants of Noah's sons and how different people spread across the world according to their language. So we could say that Genesis chapters 1 through 11 is really a pretty good introduction for the rest of the Bible. God created everything, including mankind. Man sinned. A promise of a solution was made. And in the rest of these chapters, we see how different people groups came into being and spread across the earth. So then we get to the second section of Genesis, which is Genesis chapters 12 through 50. At the end of chapter 11, we are introduced to a man whose name is Abram. Chapter 12 opens with God telling Abram to leave his country, his family, and his father's household, and to go to another land. Abram and his family at that time lived in a place called Haran. The map shows you an approximate location of Haran in Mesopotamia. So from there, Abram and his family traveled to Canaan. And also Canaan, the general area of Canaan, is shown on the map. When Abram and his family arrived in Canaan, God said, "To your offspring I will give this land." That's Genesis chapter 12, verse 7. With the story of God's interaction with Abram, we see the beginning of the Jewish faith and therefore also the beginning of the Christian faith. God made 2 important promises or covenants with Abram. The first was that Abram would have many descendants. That's in Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. Of course, later on, these descendants would need a place to live, and so there was a second promise or covenant, which is the promise or the covenant for land, and that's a few verses down in Genesis 12, verse 7. The story of Abram, who is later called Abraham, is not so much different from the story of our life as we try to live the life of faith and obedience to God. When God told Abram to leave his country and his family, Abram didn't know really where he was going and how it was all going to work out. He simply believed that God had spoken to him, and he decided to be faithful and be obedient. Sometimes God wants us to leave the familiar for the unfamiliar. God wants us to respond in faith to what He wants us to do. Sometimes there are detours in life. Sometimes things don't work out exactly the way we think they would work out. There are setbacks and successes. There are ups and downs. And just like Abraham, we don't have the privilege of knowing how it would all work out in the end. Today we can look back upon the life we have already lived, but we have no idea what the future looks like. Abraham dealt with all these things just as we do, and his faithfulness should be an example to us, an encouragement that helps us to remain faithful to God. And our faithfulness may end up being a blessing for generations to come. In Abraham's case, his faithfulness became a blessing to the entire world because Jesus is a descendant of Abraham. After Abraham's death, the story continues with the descendants of Abraham until we come to Joseph. The story tells us how Joseph and his family ended up in Egypt. The story takes a lot of twists and turns, and sometimes we may wonder if God's promise to Abraham will really come true. But through it all, this is really what happens. Genesis then closes with the people of God in Egypt. To summarize, Genesis is the book of beginnings. The beginning of the world, the beginning of everything on earth, the beginning of mankind, the beginning of the Jewish faith, and therefore also the beginning of the Christian faith. In the next session we will continue with the Pentateuch, and we will look at Exodus and Leviticus. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.